All right, welcome everyone. This is Juan Soto. I'm a Microsoft Access MVP, now 10, 11 years MVP. I just got re-awarded. I'm thrilled to have you guys here. I'm broadcasting live from Chicago. I'm the founder of Microsoft Access with SQL Server Groups. Access User Groups. And this is a little bit more about me. If you want to go ahead and take a screenshot of this, so you can reach out to me later. I usually start my season now in September. I had a great summer. So this summer, I traveled through Morocco and Spain, and as part of the Microsoft, the Spain group we have every year. This is the first time since COVID. Every year, the Spain groups puts together a wonderful presentation where we come all together and we learn about Access. So in Madrid, Spain, they invited me to present and was there. So as you can see my screen here, you got a really good presence. Juanjo is the leader of that group, amazing organizer. They typically have 25 to 30 people. So if you know Spanish, I'd encourage you to join their meetings. After and between at lunch, we went out to break bread and had a great time. This is my wife, Sarah, here. And these are three of my employees in Europe. I have multiple employees in Europe. Three of them were able to join us from our sales group and from QC testing. So it was, it was a wonderful experience. Had a great time. Looking forward to next year. And so usually what I do is I start the September, November, December with Access with SQL Server Academy parts 1, 2, and 3. And so the first part, which is where you're at today, is super simple. We are going to give you some golden nuggets tonight and talk about this journey you're about to take this year in terms of learning more about Access SQL Server. And I gotta watch the group here, the waiting room. Okay, let me see. And so, like I was saying, we have we start the sessions now in September. Took a break off for the summer. September here we're going to do with Access with SQL Server Academy Part 1, which is Introduction to Access SQL Server. Next month in October we'll have Access with SQL Server Academy Part 2, where we're going to start with SQL Server Migration Assistant and converting the Microsoft Access Northwind database over to SQL Server. And then the third part is not going to occur this November because it turns out I'm doing a program, entrepreneurship program. And I've been doing that for the last 3 months. And the culmination of that program is a trip to Israel. So I'll be traveling through Israel the first 3 weeks of November. The first week of November, I'll be in Israel. And I said, well, I'm in Israel, might as well go see Jordan and Petra and Egypt. And so I'll be in the Middle East for the first 3 weeks of November. So we will not be meeting in November. But I'll be back in December, where we're going to be finalized with advanced topics, how to optimize Access with SQL Server. And so I am thrilled to have all of you guys here. We got a great turnout. Some regulars like Klaus from Germany, who is probably like at 2 in the morning right now. So Klaus, always appreciate you showing up. Go ahead and take a screenshot of my contact information. Please reach out to me, connect with me. I always appreciate it. And one thing I wanted to mention is that I am not an expert on SQL Server, right? What I am an expert on is Access with SQL Server. And so we're known, I have my own consulting firm, IT Impact, and we're known worldwide as experts on how to make Access work with SQL Server in the cloud. And that's a topic we'll be addressing either in part, we'll start addressing in part 2 in October, we'll finish in part 3 in December. Access, if you don't know this, you will now, was here before the internet, right? So when I first started with Access was with Access 97, I think it was. And who here has started with Access 1.0? Raise your hand if you've been at Access 1.0. Let me know in the comment. One, okay. And that was way before the internet, right? And so Access was never designed to work with SQL Server in the cloud, but we know the pitfalls and the gotchas to optimize it. And you're going to learn that in this course. So hopefully you'll join us for that. Continue joining us for that. Who has joined us for the first time? Is this your first time joining a Access with SQL Server meeting? AccessUserGroups.org. Let me know in the chat there. If you is this your first timer, we welcome you. Thank you so much. Hopefully you'll continue with joining us. Henry, okay, first time. Seth, very good. Thank you. All right. So look, SQL Server is great, right? And one of the things, I don't know if you guys remember before SQL Server Express, which is the free version of SQL Server, there was a version of SQL Server, and gosh, it's eluding me, it's escaping now, but it was like intended for handhelds, right? Like you would develop it with VB6 and develop handheld applications. But when SQL Server Express came out, that was the best thing that ever happened to Access, I believe. And so we've had users over the years. I've designed solutions with up to 100 people using SQL Server. You can't get 100 people in just Access backend. You just can't. I mean, you're pushing it with 10 users. You're really pushing it with 15, and I can get it working up to 25 users. Like I've done that. I've been able to optimize the backend front end relationship and be able to get it to work with 25 users. But beyond that, what's going to happen? You have to upgrade them to SQL Server backend. Now, of course, you can go straight to a web app, but most of my clients are small businesses, business between 2 million. And yeah, I've had $500 million customers in the past, but 2 million, 20 million, $30 million custom companies, they just can't afford to go out and spend 100,000, 200,000 on a web app. First of all, it's going to take forever to do. In the meantime, they're hurting because they're using an Access backend. And so the natural progression, right? I call this the natural progression. You start with Excel, and then Excel spreadsheet gets too big, too unwieldy. You migrate to Access with Access backend and Access frontend. And then you do the next natural migrations to use SQL Server Express, and then SQL Server in the cloud. And then finally, when you have more than 100 users and you've got an enterprise that's bringing in $100 million, then you go to a web app. And so one of the, I had as a client, the largest insurance firm in the US for storage units was one of my clients at some time. And we had 100 users on there, no problem. It was great. So we you definitely can do amazing stuff with Access SQL Server. So I always make it a comparison of going from a bicycle to a car, right? So when you're using Access backend, you're going to, and it's just over SQL Server, it's like going into a car, right? And you really see the difference. Now, I'm constantly looking sideways to make sure I admit anybody who's in the waiting room. So far, we got 13 people, so we got a great turnout today. All right, let me move that closer. So SQL Server is great for improved speed, securing your data, handling many more users, and you can web enable access. Now, when we say web enable access is a term that I coined, where you move the data to the cloud, right? So you're still using Microsoft Access front end, and the data's in the cloud. I like to talk about some misconceptions. This is going to be easy, right? All I do is move the data to SQL Server, and then I create table links in my Access front end, and I'm off to the races. That's going to be great. And unfortunately, that's not the case. You can actually experience worse performance when you move to SQL Server. We're going to talk about why you would see that and how to resolve that, of course. Now, SQL Server Migration Assistant, which is my second point here, I abbreviated SSMA, is a great tool. We'll be using that in session number 2 in October. And then you're always going to end up with a great performance solution. That's another misconception, right? Bye, Klaus. Thanks for showing up.
Yeah, sorry.
No worries, man. At least you showed up. I appreciate that.
Yeah, but too tired.
Okay, no worries. Klaus, by the way, is an expert SQL Server migration assistant, so hopefully he'll be able to be here in October when we go through this. And then the other thing is
maybe I don't
right?
know. I'm working now a little bit earlier, so I have to go to bed earlier.
No worries. I will hopefully talk to you in October.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So look, I threw in a little joke there that you can tackle war hunger once you finish this, but the fact of the matter is there is some work that you'll need to do in order to make this relationship between Access and SQL Server work. It just is. It's just unfortunate, but you have to know what these pitfalls are, what these issues are. All right. So at this point, you probably want to know, okay, what version of SQL Server, right? And I'm going to mention the great Yogi Berra, the coach of the New York Yankees. He had these Yogi Berraisms, right? That he would, and one of the things he would say, when you take a curve, when you see a curve, just take it, right? So that was attributed to him. And Well, the reason he would say that is he had to get to his house. He had this tree on the road, splitting up the road left and right, and so any turn you took, you would still get to his house. So that's why he said, when you see a curve, just take it. And when you see SQL Server in this case, just use it, right? So oftentimes when I get a customer who wants to migrate to SQL Server, I do ask them what version of SQL Server they have. I don't make them buy Enterprise, Standard, Express, whatever they use currently. That's what I use, right? Now, if it's an old version of SQL Server, the other day I was at a client here in Chicago. They are a factory that they produce smocks for cooks, line cooks, waiters, and all that. Very good, very nice smocks and uniforms. He had SQL Server 2008. And I'm like, this is you're not getting updates. You're not getting security updates. You're not getting updates at all. It was running on SQL Server 2000. That also was obsolete. And as a consultant, I'm obligated to write to him an email saying, as your consultant, I advise you to upgrade your SQL Server and your SQL Server and your Windows Server. Why? Because if the guy ever gets hacked or he loses his system, I don't want him to come after me saying, well, you should have told me, you're my consultant, right? So I make sure I document that. I got somebody here who wants to come in. Let me admit them. So no matter what version of SQL Server your company has or your customer has, it's fine. I mean, if it's way out of date, it needs to be updated, right? But you still can use it. Again, because you're going from a bicycle, which is Access Backend, to a car, which is SQL Server. You're going to be downloading these tools for the October session. So your first homework will be to make sure when you come in October for the second part of SQL Server with Access Academy, is that you bring and you install these tools on your computer, right? So you have to have a copy of Office, obviously. Make sure you download the SQL Server version for developers, all right? SQL Server developers, and I'll show you those links with you. There are more updated drivers. There's now ODBC driver 18 and OLADB 19. These two are fine too, 17 and 18. And I wrote that comment, ADODB lives, because at some point Microsoft was going to discontinue it, but they realized the uproar from the community so much that they decided to continue. And you're going to also install SQL Server Migration Assist. So I'm going to give you a list of things to have ready for the October session to make sure that you're ready to dive into a lab that we're going to have in October to upgrade Northwind to your local PC. All right, now, having said all that, there are some limitations of SQL Server Express, and you need to be aware of them as consultants or as users. You need to understand what and be able to inform management, right? First of all, is 11 gigs of hard drive space. If your database grows beyond 11 gigs, you're SOL. You need to upgrade to SQL Server Standard Edition. You only have 1 gig of RAM. Now, you can have a 32 gigs of RAM on your server. It's only going to use 1 gig of RAM on that server, right? If you have 4 more cores, I mean, these days, it's ridiculous how many cores the server comes up with. I had a customer who has 32 cores, but it's only going to use one socket, 4 cores of your server. And now, having said all that, and all the years I've been doing this, which has been now almost 30 years, I can count on one hand the customers who had to upgrade to SQL Server Standard Edition, right, which is the next upgrade from Express. One hand. So SQL Server Express, in spite of being able to use 1 gig of RAM, in spite of only using 4 sockets, in spite of only being able to have 11 gigs of hard drive space, that's plenty for where you're coming from, because you're coming from, think about it, right? Microsoft Access databases are, for the most part, low transaction, low amount of hard drive space. We're not talking about Amazon database here, right? We're not talking about hundreds of transactions per minute or 1,000 per minute per second, right? We're talking about mostly departmental databases, or the 25 users or 50 users. They're not generating tons of data. To give you for instance, you know that there is a limitation, or if you don't, you're going to find out now. There's a limitation on 2 gig of hard drive space on Microsoft Access databases, right? So as you hit that 2 gig, as you approach that 2 gig, you're going to have decremental performance issues. And then when you hit the 2 gig, it just stops working. It just stops dead in the tracks, right? So I get calls from time to time from customers, new customers that call me up and says, "Hey, Juan, my database stopped working." And so when I pried in deeper, I realized they have already met that 2 gigs of hard drive space. You take those 2 gigs and you import it to SQL Server, which we're going to go over this academy. That's going to turn into maybe 500 megabytes, right? So not only you're going from 2 gigs to 11 gigs, but it's the way how a SQL Server stores the information is so much more efficient to access it, right? So this 11 gigs of hard drive space that you get with SQL Server Express, it's probably 33 gigs of access space. If your access would allow you to grow to 33 gigs, right? It's 3 times as compact. It's just SQL Server does a great job of compacting the data so that you don't have to worry about the hard drive space when you're going from Access, right? Or you're going from Excel straight into SQL Server Access frontend. And anything you get, any version of SQL Server is just going to run around Access backends. All right, so this is the first nugget I like to give you, and that is before you upgrade to SQL Server, you gotta fix performance issues in Access, right? Somebody calls you up and says, "Hey, I need you to upgrade me to SQL Server backend," or your boss calls you up, or your department manager calls you up. And usually they call you at the worst possible time. The database is super slow, people are crashing, right? So you need to make sure that you resolve key issues: lack of indexes, bad relational design, right? Bad tables. Why is it that these Access databases have a bad reputation with IT? Because you haven't lived long enough. If you live long enough, you'll know that IT hates Microsoft Access. Well, I'll tell you why IT hates it. Because Access comes with Office, right? So, and 90% of the corporate world out there, when you get Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook, you also get Access, right? So usually it goes like this. There's a huge problem in printing the labels at the end of the production line for skids, right? So people are using Word or Excel to create labels, and now they want to slap a barcode on it, and they want it to read with the ERP system, and so they go to IT, and they tell the CIO of this big company has a SAP or a huge multi-million-dollar ERP system, and said, "Hey, can you write us a little program that will create 8x by 11 labels that we can slap onto our skids at the end of the production line with this, and that?" Sure, we'll get around to it. And the weeks go by and the months go by and they don't hear anything. You go back to the CIO and says, "Yeah, the PM office has that scheduled for like in 12 months. Why? Because they're in the midst of a huge upgrade for ERP that's 1 year behind schedule, multi-million-dollars were out of budget, and the last thing he cares about is a freaking label skid, right? A label that gets slapped out of the other production line of the skid. And so sometimes what they'll even tell them says, "Why don't you just use Excel, right, to create the label, or use Access, right?" So luckily for the production department manager, Bob in the warehouse is a really smart guy. This guy, he knows Office backwards and forwards, and he offers to solve the problem. So Bob goes out there, creates a Microsoft Access database because Access comes with Office. So what does that mean? There's an implicit authorization from the IT department to use Access, right? That's another problem I have with the CIOs and these department managers at IT. They hate Access, right? But then they install it everywhere. So how do you expect the people to react? You give them the tools of Office, which includes Access, and then you're upset because they create these bad Access databases. So there's an implicit authorization. So Bob goes out there, he creates this wonderful Access database, right? I mean, he knocks it out of the park. He imports the ERP reports in CSV format, so he's got the products in the combo box, and you can pick the product that you're producing online. And when you do that, it automatically creates a barcode because he downloaded a barcode font off the 3 of 9 off the internet, and he creates an amazing Access database. And every line has a PC now on this factory. It's got 20 lines. And they have a PC on each line with a printer to print these labels. And every time there's a skid that comes out, they slap the label. Everybody's happy. Everybody just loves Bob, right? Bob is a young kid. He's 20. Ends up leaving, no longer with the firm. And the Access database starts having issues, starts having problems and bugs and so forth. And then one day out of the blue, it stops working altogether. Now you got a major crisis on your hands because you have this production line that's the root revenue of this company, right? That stopped because nobody can figure out how to solve this Access database issues that's printing labels. And that's the crux of it. These Access programs turn into mission critical programs for the enterprise. And when they're mission critical and they're not compact and repair on a regular basis, not designed well, because God bless Bob, he did what he could, right? But and in this case, he created a great relational model, right? All his tables have primary keys, and he's got foreign keys in there, and he's got multiple tables, and he's reading from CSV. But that's not always the case. I mean, I can't tell you countless times people call me up who need help with the database that's mission critical, but now it's failing. And they need an expert like us to help them out, right? And the reason being is that it wasn't designed correctly. They didn't have the right relational model. It's buggy. It required a lot of hand holding. And when Bob leaves, it goes all go hell in a handbasket. And now a mission critical app that is not working correctly falls into the hands of the IT department. And the first thing they do is they call IT and says, hey, I got this label program, it's not working. All right, whatever is it from? Access. Oh, what do you mean Access? What you were using Access for? Where you have SAP? So, well, remember 2 years ago, I went to you guys, I asked you for a label program, you never did it. We decided to use Access. So they come down, look at the Access program. Nobody is an expert in Access in IT. They're experts in SQL Server, Oracle, whatever it is, but nobody does an Access, and they just hate it because then the vice president of operations gets involved. He calls the CIO and says, hey, I got skids down there with no labels. I need this fixed ASAP. And what is the CIO going to say? I don't know Access. I have no idea. No, he's got to say, okay, I'll go take a look. And I'll have my DBA will look into, right? So the assumption here is I'll send my DBA, who's a whiz in SQL Server. DBA stands for the database administrator, in case you were wondering. He says it's DBA out there because the assumption is the guy should know Access. Hey, you're a DBA. Why don't you go check it out? And that pisses DBAs to and when the people assume that he's an Access expert. So he goes out there, he tries what he could, right? And their thing is, what's funny to me is their first inclination, we'll create a web app. Okay, the vice president operations says, okay, well, great, I don't care. When's it going to be ready? Well, it should be ready in 6 months. Says, dude, do you not see the skids piling up at the end of the warehouse without labels? And so, so they end up calling somebody like me to come in and solve their issue. All right. Now, this is, there's a huge inclination to use SharePoint, right? You can technically migrate your data back into SharePoint, and then that is where you can store your data. Well, I don't recommend it. It's their SharePoint list. SharePoint is not the best relational database. It's great for storing documents and for websites, internal websites, but it's just not going to be good. One of my employees, Ben Clothier, wrote the only book. He's brilliant. He wrote the only book in existence on how to use Access with SharePoint. He's a co-author of that book. And sometimes the other author joins us here. He's the leader for Access User Group East Western, and he's sometimes joins us, but I don't see him here today. But he'll be the first one to tell you, don't use SharePoint. And he wrote the only book on how to use Access with SharePoint, so don't do that. All right. The other aspect of this is we're going to start using DSN, but then I'm going to show you how to use DSN list. DSN stands for, I know that D stands for data, N stands for name, but I think data source name. And that's something that you would do in ODBC. And they're convenient. You set it up once in FPC, and then you have access to other tables in SQL Server. Instead, we're going to use code to, we're going to do that in December. We're going to learn how to do the DSN list. All right. Now, you're going to hear through this course, you're going to hear these terms, right? DAO stands for Data Access Objects. That's the native technology the technology layer that Access uses, the Access engine uses to access data. And the ADODB, ADA stands for Active Data Objects, I think is what it is, ADODB. That's a technology that's agnostic to database. So you can use ADODB with Oracle, with SQL Server. You can use it as long as you have the right drivers. You can use it, right? And so what's going to happen here is that during this course, we're going to teach you how to leverage ADODB to go straight to SQL Server. All right. So let's say, for example, this is something you'll learn later. Let's say, for example, you have to insert 100,000 lines of new orders that you got off the website in CSV file. You have to upload that to SQL Server. And you say, okay, this is easy. I'll just import the data into the Access as a table, temporary table. And then I've got my order data table linked already from SQL Server. I'll just do an insert query from Access to SQL Server. And when you do that, you quickly realize 100,000 records inserting to SQL Server is a peta. It takes forever. I call them coffee breaks. You go get a coffee, come back, go check the water cooler, come back, and it's just gonna it can be anywhere from a few minutes to never. It'll actually, sometimes I've seen a timeout. It's just not the recommended way to handle data. But in this course, we're going to show you how to leverage ADODB so that you can bypass the Access engine altogether and be able to go straight to SQL Server. All right. So say, for example, your boss comes to you and says, I need you to increase all our products by 5%, the prices by 5%, especially these days where you have a lot of inflation going on. That's a very common thing to do, right? You need to increase prices. And so you're like, okay, I'll create an update query in Access, and I'll link to the product table, and I'll increase prices by multiplying times 1.05, right? 5% increase. Well, that too takes forever. So what I'll show you is how you can do that in your code with ADODB in order to send it straight to the server. So we're going to bypass DAO altogether, and we go straight to the server. And we tell the server, take this SQL statement, execute it over there. Let me know if it's okay when you're done executing. So you're actually going to learn in this course how to bypass the Access engine altogether, so you can do action queries, update, insert, delete queries, right? So that you don't have to take coffee breaks to get things done. So that's something we constantly hear in DAO or ADODB. Excuse me, I am recovering from an asthma problems, and I need to take a little quick break here. All right. So this is the secret sauce where I'm talking about this slide. This is it, right? You're going to use views in SQL Server. So views, when you see that term views, think queries, right? And Access, they're called queries. And SQL Server, they're called views. We're going to use stored procedures. You're going to learn how to create basic stored procedures. You're going to learn to offload work to SQL Server. You want SQL Server to do the processing, especially when it comes to update queries, delete queries, insert queries. And you're going to learn to become a SQL Server developer. I mean, that's just the crux of it. If you really want to optimize Access with SQL Server, if you want to take it to the next level, you have to become a SQL Server developer. We're going to help you with that journey. You're going to love it. I mean, when I first went through this many years ago, when I had hair on my head, I love the tool, SQL Server Management Studio tools. I thought the IntelliSense and SQL Server was unbelievable. 25 years later, I just now seen the Access team start to incorporate some of that into Access with the SQL Monaco updates coming later this year, supposedly coming later this year. And we're going to talk about AZADB. This is a technique I created that's part of the IT Impact framework that is highly optimized for SQL Server. All right, we talked about this earlier. SQL Server Migration Assistant for Access, right? This is an amazing tool. I mean, before I had this SSMA, it was a pain in the ass to migrate data to SQL Server. You would actually use SQL Server itself to migrate Access data. It wasn't foolproof. There were a lot of gotchas, and SSMA makes it so easy. It creates the tables for you in SQL Server. It automatically applies rules and knows how to optimize those tables and Access with SQL Server. Then you can use it throughout your project, right? Because think about it. Let's say, for example, it's your job. Oh, let me hit Alphonse. If your job is to migrate data to SQL Server, you're gonna I was measuring. I thought, well, it's super. It's your job to migrate data to SQL Server. You have to do a series of things to your tables in order to optimize them with SQL Server. You have to make sure every table has a timestamp field. You have to make sure that your yes/no fields have a default 0, because these are all bugs that you need to avoid and you don't know about, right? No, most of the people who use SQL Server Migration Assistant, they don't realize that the assistant is doing all of this for you in the background. And so we're going to go over those issues and migrate the data. But it creates the database, it creates your tables, and then it uploads the data for you. So if you have 20 tables and a total of 50,000 rows, all of that gets automatically created for you. It creates indexes and it creates a row version to data fields, which we talk about, which sometimes called timestamps. And so, okay. If your boss comes to you and says, hey, we have this mission critical database, it's an ERP system that we use in this small factory of this $14 million factory. This is a true example, by the way. Customer calls me up. They have a $14 million ammunition factory here in Michigan. They call me up and well, in their case, they're using Excel and we created a system from scratch. But I had another factory in Memphis, Tennessee, which I find out went bankrupt. They were a customer of mine for many years ago, and I spent a year migrating their systems to SQL Server backend. But the first step is to grab the backend data file, upgrade it to SQL Server, optimize the relationship with that SQL Server. Well, that takes several months, if not several weeks, if not a month, to do that. And so by the time every time you grab a backend, it's going to be obsolete immediately once people start adding more records and doing records with the system, right? So we use SQL Server Migration Assistant throughout the project. We'll be discussing about this in October, to update the data on a regular basis, right? So I'll give you, for instance, once I do my first optimization pass, and I want to create a beta version for the customer to play with, I may have taken that data 6 weeks ago. So the customer doesn't want to see old data. They want to see the most recent data in SQL Server, right? They're excited. You came back with the SQL Server version. So, okay, let's take a look to see how fast this is. And so I use SQL Server Migration Assistant to update the data in SQL Server, and I create a beta version alpha version, right? And then beta version, then multiple updates to SQL Server. And I do that throughout the project until the customer is happy with the performance. The bugs have been ironed out. Now we're ready to go live, and I do a final migration using SQL Server Migration Assistant. So it's so easy. It's not even fun. You guys are going to love it, right? So it's something you're going to learn in October. All right. So one of the things that we need to avoid here is tables with no indexes. Now, the problem with tables with no indexes, well, the problem you have here is Access is very forgiving. I mean, if you have a person who creates an Access database for the company, a small department database for the company, they can, in theory, use that system with no indexes, spaces in their fields, no foreign keys. It'll work fine, but it won't work once you migrate the data to SQL Server. Every table needs a primary key in order to edit the data in Access. right? So you may have a situation where you have a table with no primary key, and you upload that table to SQL Server, and you link it back to the Access database. And now, when you open that table in your data entry form to add a new order, it tells you it's read-only. So every table needs a primary key. And you want to avoid the absence of foreign keys. Now, foreign keys, and stop me if you don't know these terms, I can further explain to you. But foreign keys are it's a fancy name for alternate indexes, right? So let's say, for example, you have the typical order header table and order details. What's in the order header? The order header is going to have the customer ID, the order date, the destination of the order, right? Think of those things that are independent from the items being ordered, right? So when you go into Amazon, you create an order on the Amazon, and you go to checkout. What is the Amazon asking you? What's your credit card? What's the address to ship it to? Right? How fast do you want to ship? All that's saved in the order header table, or main table. And then the items you brought are the order details table. And so every time I tell my students, every time you set out to design and use data schema for a new project, always think in terms of order header or details, right? What goes in the order header, and what goes in the order details. In order details, you have the primary key, which is not the order ID, right? So in the order header, you have order ID as the primary key. And the order details, you have maybe line order ID or order or line item ID as your primary key. And then you have the order ID as the secondary key in that table that's linked to the order header, right? Because that way you identify which items go with the order in the order header table. So you use that order ID in both tables. It's a primary key in the order header. It's a foreign key or secondary key in the order line items, and they're linked together. And so that's why I'm saying you have to make sure you have an index on that order ID in the line items table. Otherwise, your database is going to be too slow. Now, I come across this situation a lot. Complex primary keys. What is that? Well, these are companies that insist on looking at the order number and be able to tell what it is, right? Okay, so I once had a customer had a really long order ID, right? And it says, okay, so we start with the year 2022, and then it's followed by the month, and then it's followed by a date, and then it's followed by the expiration date, and then that's followed by the product ID, product category, right? I mean, it's this complex formula to create a primary key in the order header table, and you really shouldn't be doing that. It should be something simple, sequential numbers that start with the number 1 and continue to infinity. And so I try to dissuade the customer from that. It says, look, and sometimes they want to insert letters in there, and that's even worse still, because the primary key is used to optimize the queries. And if you have primary keys that are text, that's going to be slower than primary keys that are formatted as numbers or long integers, right? And so I tell the customer, what you're actually doing here is not right. It needs to be a sequential number that's an integer, and it doesn't mean anything. It's all internalized. Now, what I do there is I still have their complex order number, but now it's a secondary column in the order header table, right? So I convince them that they'll still get their little number, and they see that number on the form, but I don't use that number when I link tables. I use my own internal order ID that's an integer and all that. So I move away from that, using that complex keys. All right, let's talk about queries now. So, excuse me here, let me rehydrate. We're almost done for this first session. This is a more introductory session. I'm going to open the mic up for questions here in a few minutes, and then we're wrapping up. All right, so when you migrate queries to views and SQL Server, you don't have to migrate every query, right? I prefer not to overwhelm the server with all these views. Instead, I only migrate queries that are complex, multiple relationships, multiple tables, right? Complex queries that are just too slow to access. Why? Because think about it. When you run a query in Access that has multiple joins, right? You got the order header table here, order details, then you got the customer table, then you got shipping table, then you've got the other auxiliary tables, right? so that you can create this view, this query of multiple columns. Well, if you got a very large database, right, several 100,000 records, and you have multiple users, that's going to take a long time. So what happens is Access sends that query to SQL Server, and it tells SQL Server, okay, here's the query. Now, this used to be far worse back in the day when I first started migrating SQL Server tables. But the drivers, that ODBC 17 I talked to you about earlier, is so much better. But the driver, when you install that ODBC driver in that workstation, it's acting as a traffic cop with that SQL Server, and it's looking at that SQL Server query, the Access query, right? And this is something you're going to learn in October. The syntax for queries and Access is not the same syntax in SQL Server. It's similar, not the same. So what does the driver do? ODBC driver does? It translates that into a syntax the query the server says, right? The server could care less what you're trying to do in a query, but it still needs to understand what tables, what fields, what relationships. And so the ODBC driver is taking a half of a second or a quarter of a second to look at your queries and translating that into equivalent SQL Server queries and sends those off to the SQL Server. That's something people don't misunderstand. They don't realize they take this one query, the driver takes this one query and breaks it up to multiple queries and sends it off for process in SQL Server. That's why we rather avoid all of that overhead and just use a query on the server. So in this case, you'll see this in October where you replace this query with 5 tables in it with just one view, that looks like a table in Access, and the server is handling everything and just returning back the results to Access. But one thing that you need to avoid at all costs is what's called the hybrid queries. Hybrid query is using SQL Server tables with local access tables. And I'll give you a great example of that, all right? We have 50 states in the United States. Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, right? So you have a table, for example, that has 50 states and maybe some of the territories like Puerto Rico and Guam and so forth. So maybe 53, 54 records. And you're like, well, I don't need this small table on SQL Server. And you don't, for the most part, you don't. You don't need to migrate, except when you need to query it against SQL Server tables, right? But you decided not to migrate that table to SQL Server. That's a small table. I'll leave it in Access, right? Not only do you leave it in Access, you left it in the front end. Okay. Why? Because you use that combo boxes, right? When they do the query, list the table, and it's super quick because it's a local table of states. So you say, I'm not going to migrate it. But then you have to create a query that includes that state table with other tables in SQL Server. That's what's called a hybrid query, right? And the only table and these multitude of tables that you have in this query is that local state table. What happens there? The ODBC driver looks at that and says, oh, there is no state table in SQL Server. So what does it do? It sends you all the data from every table in that query back to Access and pushes it over the network and to that local PC and says, here, you do the query, right? So along comes this massive data dump of the order header table. Every record in the order details, and the order details table can be quite big, right? Think about it. If you have 50,000 orders and every customer on average orders 5 items, that's what? That's 250,000 records. All 250,000 records now get dumped onto that PC, and you're looking at this query executing, and you see this progress bar is inching along little by little. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die here waiting for this query. And you're in the development stage. You haven't given this all to the users yet. Imagine when the users get it, right? They're gonna kill you. They'll come after you like they come after Frankenstein with torches in the night, looking for you in your office. So you want to avoid that at all costs, right? You want everything to be visible in SQL Server. In that particular case, you actually have 2 tables for states. You continue to have the table on the front end for the states because there's no need to read it from SQL Server. We're not adding states here anytime soon, right? So to the United States, we're not adding to the United States, so many more states anytime soon here. So you continue using that state drop down with the local table on your front end. but then you create a duplicate copy on the server so that when you hand that query off to SQL Server, it automatically sees it and it processes it for you and everything else. All right. Homework. All right. So you're going to install the developer edition of SQL Server. So let's go ahead and get these links for you guys. I'll paste them into the comments, and then you can then download these, and I'll show you where to find them here. And I'm going to unmute. I'm going to unmute. How do I unmute? You can go ahead and unmute yourselves. That's all to unmute. There you go. All right. So, okay. So we're going to do download SQL Server Developer Edition. Okay. Now Microsoft wants you to buy SQL Server, so they're going to bury this here. SQL Server on the edge, SQL Server on premises, right? Here's what you want, right? So download now. Let me see if I click this, it starts downloading. Now, did it start downloading? Let me see. I wonder if it started downloading. Yeah, it did. All right. So let me give you this link here. Copy link. Copy link address. Put that here. All right, that's your first one. All right. Okay, so you download SQL Server Edition. Then, if you need Office installed, just go ahead and grab a test evaluation of Office just before. We meet every second Tuesday of the month, right? So make sure that you're here October. So October second Tuesday would be October 11th. All right. I think somebody just joined us, Peter. Somebody just joined us. Sorry, we're toward the end now. But you didn't. We're going to record. We're recording this, so this will be uploaded. So I'm sorry you missed the first part of it, but basically I'm going over the homework now. Yeah, I'm in the comment. If you already have Express, that's fine. Like remember what I said. No matter which version of SQL Server you have, it's fine. But you can have both SQL Server Express and Developer Edition. I like the Developer Edition because it doesn't limit you 1 gig of RAM. Or 11 gigs of hard drive space, but you can absolutely you can use SQL Server Express, not a problem. So if you want Express, here's the link to that. So I'm gonna copy this link address. And Express is what you would use with your clients or at work if they won't want you to they'll get you the paid version of SQL Server. All right, and then now we need to download ODBC SQL Server driver, and here we want to this one 18 for SQL Server. Now there are two versions, right? There's a 64-bit and a 32-bit. Most modern PCs that are running Windows 11 is 64-bit, so use that one first. I'm gonna send you this one. If you have a 32-bit computer, it's really time for an upgrade. So I'll send you the 64-bit. Install this one because for the most part that's the one you want. So that takes care of the ODBC. Now I'm going to give you the MS OLADB driver for SQL Server. And that one is, I believe, 19. Oh, a second here. Download. Okay, here it is. Download ODBC driver. Okay, 19. No, this is 19. Oh, we see 18 and 19. All right, copy link address. And I'm putting these in the chat, so make sure you grab these links before we go because the chat disappears. All right, so I'm gonna open up to questions. Richard, I'm sorry you were late. I think you were late, but do you guys have any questions for me before we go? Did you guys like the presentation, by the way? Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I've been developing Microsoft Access for quite a long time. In fact, last year I converted a huge Access 97 accounting application that used SQL Server 2000, and I converted it all by myself to SQL Server 2019. But I didn't even know that the migration assistant was even available. So I'm logged on. I just found Access User Groups about 2 months ago, and I'm learning stuff. I've been developing it with Access a long time. I'm using a lot of stuff that I've learned. This is amazing what you can do with Microsoft Access.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. And remind me in October that I'd like to show you examples of professionally done Access database that I use a demo when I have new customers or leads call me. It's important that when people call your practice, that you can demonstrate that you can make accessing advanced. So I'll show you what I use to demo to win over the hearts and minds of people who have them turn over the credit card to me. All right, Jeff, thank you very much. Joe, very good. Please, before you go, I'm going to ask you guys for, please tweet about this. My Twitter handle is jsoto22. Let people know, hey man, we had a great time. Hey, if you didn't have a great time, say so. Don't lie on my behalf. But if you like what you did, or what you heard today, please tweet about it. Include me in the link. Follow me on Twitter, and hopefully we can get more people to visit us in October, so they can watch this recording and then join us in October. So a lot of you said earlier today you're new to this group. I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is something we do free. All the presenters in our group, we have multiple groups at AccessUserGroups.org. There's Access Europe, Access Lunchtime by Maria, my good friend Maria Barnes, all another Access MVP, Access Pacific. And we encourage you to look at those sessions as well. And if you want to present, please reach out. They're always looking for presenters. If you're an Excel expert, let them know. If you have a technique that you develop in Access you're really proud of, please reach out to them. We all do this free of charge. I do it also because I need to become. I get it counts towards my Microsoft MVP. I get this little MVP badge every year. I'm not sure if I can show it to you guys on the camera. There you go. I got these. I got them all lined up here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. MVP, but I love doing this. You can tell. I mean, you stick a quarter of me, I'll talk all night. I mean, if it were up to me, we'd be here till 11 o'clock, right? We would do SQL Server Academy Part 2, Part 3 all night, tonight. But the fact is that there's a lot to discuss, a lot to process. I threw a lot of different terms to you guys. I need you to be ready. So we do the exercise, the lab. So October is going to be the lab where we migrate Northwind to SQL Server. And yeah, I love doing this. And it used to be before the pandemic, I would travel the country and I would do this at SQL Saturdays. That's SQLSaturdays.com, which I believe is back. They're still doing SQL Saturdays now. And it's all moved virtually. And we decided I created this organization, AccessUserGroups.org, many years ago. And there is a particular tool on there that we're going to look at in October. It's called the T-SQL Converter tool that will take your Access query and convert it to SQL Server format. And it also converts it to text so you can easily paste in your code. It's an amazing tool. It's free of charge. It took us a long time to develop. It's on the website. We're going to go over that in October. Anybody else have any questions for me before we go? All right, so don't forget to tweet. Don't forget to join me at the Access Group user group. Let me give you a copy of this here. Let me see. I'm gonna give you a copy of this link. You can search for it, or you can just use this link and join up. I do have to approve you, so almost nobody gets rejected. I reject recruiters, right? I reject people who don't have a lot of their profile. They're not made up. Right? I would try to avoid spamming in that group. And if you do join, you also say how you enjoyed the session or did not enjoy the session. Leave some feedback for me in that group, and that's it. So look, thank you for coming. This is your servant here, Juan Soto from Chicago, and I will see you in October, second Tuesday in October, which is Tuesday the October what? Let's see. Okay, I'm going back now. What is September? Okay. October 4th? No. 11th. October 11th. I'll see you guys here. So long, everyone. Thank you.